Tokyo, Japan is one of the most extraordinary cities in the world, a huge metropolis with neon lights, advanced technology, and bustling streets, home to millions of people. However, it also has a deep-rooted history and many places where the new and the old come together. One of these places is the historic Asakusa district. Here, temples built hundreds of years ago stand next to modern skyscrapers. In the narrow streets lined with shops, restaurants, and cafes, you can feel the pulse of the city and its long tradition. Among the old buildings and temples, there is a small apartment building which looks like any other. Built over 60 years ago, the building consists of several floors with small apartments. In recent times, the building has been considered somewhat run down. However, despite its appearance, it offers a unique atmosphere that attracts people looking for a special place to live. One such person was a young man named Yuji Nakamura. Yuji was a writer who liked to spend most of his time alone working on his stories. He didn't need much space and just wanted a quiet place to live where he could concentrate on his work. When he saw the apartment in the old building in Asakusa, he immediately fell in love with it. The apartment was small but cozy. Despite its age, it was in good condition and had everything needed for living. What particularly appealed to Yuji was the location. The apartment was situated in a quiet street away from the hustle and bustle. This gave him the peace and quiet he needed to work undisturbed. The owner of the building told Yuji that the apartment had been empty for some time and no one had lived there for months. People usually moved in but then quickly moved out again. When Yuji heard this, he just laughed it off and said that he wasn't afraid of such stories. So he signed the contract and moved into the apartment. At first, everything seemed perfect. The apartment was just what Yuji was looking for. The neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, and he could start his work without any problems. But as the days passed, Yuji began to realize that the apartment had a dark secret. Every night at 1:13 a.m., he would hear strange noises coming from the walls. At first, it was just a faint scratching sound, but it got louder and louder until it sounded like someone was trying to break through the wall. Accompanied by this noise, Yuji heard a soft voice whispering, "Get out! You're not here." The voice was feminine, and although it was very soft, he could hear it clearly. It didn't seem to come from anywhere in particular, but rather from inside the walls themselves. Yuji was scared, but at first he tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. Maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks on him because of the old building and the stories that came with it. But as the nights went by, the scratching sounds and whispers continued. Yuji couldn't take it anymore and decided to take action. He bought a recorder and placed it next to his bed to capture the noise. The next night, when the scratching started and the whispers echoed through the room, the recorder captured it all. Yuji had proof of what was happening. Next morning, he went straight to the police and told them what had happened. But when he played the recording for them, they couldn't find any evidence of a threat. According to the police, it was just an old building making old noises. Desperate, Yuji returned home. He couldn't understand why the police didn't believe him. He knew what he had heard, and he had the recording to prove it. Feeling helpless, he decided to deal with the situation on his own. As the days passed, Yuji began to notice other strange things happening in the apartment. For example, when he looked into the mirror, the light suddenly dimmed. Then when he talked on the phone, he could hear voices as if someone else was talking with him. All these experiences made him think that the apartment had a dark secret that no one knew about. Then there were his dreams. Every night he dreamed of the same thing. In his dreams he could feel the scratching in the wall and hear the same voice saying, "I was here before you." These dreams were so real that he often woke up with a start and could still hear the voice whispering in his ear. Meanwhile, Yuji continued his research into the history of the apartment and the building. He wanted to know if there had ever been a similar case or if there was some other explanation for the strange occurrences in the apartment. But the more he searched, the more confused he became. No one in the neighborhood knew anything about the history of the apartment, and the owner of the building didn't seem willing to share any information either. One night, the scratching in the wall became louder than ever before. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and part of the wall collapsed, revealing a small opening behind it. Yuji was scared, but also curious to see what was going on. He took a flashlight and carefully looked through the gap. What he saw made him gasp in surprise. Inside the wall, there was a dark cavity that looked like a small room. There was a box in the corner and a faint light coming from somewhere inside. Yuji was determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, so he took a deep breath and reached for the doorknob. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. What Yuji found inside the wall was unbelievable. It was a small room with a dusty floor and cobwebs in the corners. The only light came from a small opening in the wall, which let in some faint sunlight. But what caught Yuji's attention the most was a small box in the corner of the room. He went over and carefully opened it. Inside, he found some old letters and photographs of a young woman. As Yuji looked through the letters and pictures, he realized that the woman in the photos was the same one whose voice he had heard in his dreams. The letters were written in a beautiful handwriting and spoke of a terrible fate that had befallen the woman. The letters told the story of a young woman named Yoko Miyazaki who had moved into the apartment in 1973. She wrote about how she felt at home there and how happy she was to have finally found a place to live. But then suddenly, the tone of the letters changed. Yoko began writing about strange things happening in the apartment, scratching in the walls and whispering voices. She was scared and didn't know what to do. She wrote that she had spoken to the police, but they hadn't been able to help her. No one believed her story and she felt completely alone. Then the letters stopped abruptly. The last entry was dated March 1974. Yuji couldn't believe what he was reading. It was as if Yoko's story was coming to life before his eyes. Could it be that she was still trapped in the apartment and that her soul was trying to tell him her story? Determined to find out the truth, Yuji took the documents to the police and asked them to reopen the case. After examining the evidence, the police agreed to take another look at the old case. They took DNA samples from the remains in the wall to identify the victim. Meanwhile, Yuji couldn't get the story of Yoko Miyazaki out of his mind. He wondered what had happened to her and why nobody had been able to help her back then. A few days later, the police called Yuji and told him that the DNA tests had revealed the identity of the victim. It was Yoko Miyazaki, who had disappeared 50 years ago. The police also found out that Yoko's file had been closed without explanation. Why had no one been looking for her all these years? Who was responsible for her death? And how did her body end up in the wall of the apartment? Overwhelmed by the news, Yuji decided to leave the apartment. He couldn't bear the thought that such a terrible crime had happened right under his nose and that he had been so close to danger without knowing it. Before leaving, he placed a bouquet of flowers outside the apartment door. It was the least he could do for Yoko after all she had suffered. But even after leaving the apartment, Yuji couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. Every year on March, exactly 50 years after Yoko's disappearance, he received a message on the apartment door. It was written in Japanese and said, "I'm here, still waiting." Was it the spirit of Yoko seeking justice? Was it the memory of the walls that remembered the events of the past? Or was it something else entirely? Yuji never found an answer to this question, but it didn't matter anymore. He knew that Yoko had finally found peace, and that was all that mattered. Weeks later, the person who owned the building took his own life. In his will, he wrote, "I was the cause. Walls don't forget," implying that he had trapped Yoko in the wall of the building. But why did he do it? What was his connection to Yoko? And what was he hiding all these years? This case remains a mystery. Even though the person responsible is no longer alive, there are still many unanswered questions. Yuji never forgot Yoko and the terrible fate that befell her. He dedicated his next book to her, telling her story and making sure that she would finally be remembered. The story of Yoko Miyazaki reminds us that even in the most modern cities, there are still dark secrets hidden beneath the surface. It's a story of injustice, of a woman who was forgotten by everyone, even in death. But above all, it's a story of hope. The hope that even after 50 years, the truth can be revealed and justice can be done.